Thank you, Andrea, and thank you everyone logged on for joining today. My name is Victoria DiBiase, and I've had the pleasure of being part of the Real Food Blends team for the past 5 years. And I currently work in medical affairs for tube feeding at Nutrition North America, the sponsor of today's event. So if we move on to the next slide. For anyone who's new to learning about Real Food Blends was founded by a family who has a tube-fed child. Andrea, we can actually back up to the previous slide. Thank you. So Real Food Blends was founded by a family who has a tube-fed child named AJ. Now, they tried so many different formulas with AJ, and he just struggled with intolerances to any of the conventional formulas that they had tried. So that's when mom and dad decided to take matters into their own hands, and they started blending at home for him. He did so well and quickly saw improvements in things like reflux, vomiting, bowel regularity. And in fact, he was tolerating his home blends so well that the family decided to take a trip to Disney World. And so that was really their light bulb moment that led to the creation of Real Food Blends, to really help other families and offer a convenient, ready-to-feed blenderized option for people with feeding tubes. And we always called AJ our CIO, or Chief Inspiration Officer, because he is truly the inspiration behind Real Food Blends, which is 100% real food and a variety of 6 meals and 1 snack for kids and adults with feeding tubes. We're very excited to now be part of the Nutricia family of brands with an overall mission to bring health through food to as many people as possible. And so without further delay, I am excited to introduce our speakers for today's event, Hilarie and Nicole Bolufe. Hilarie is a registered dietitian and a certified specialist in pediatrics who's been helping families with tube feeding for over 7 years. She's the owner and the founder of Blended Tube Feeding, a private practice dedicated to helping tube-fed patients incorporate real food into their routines so that they can feel better and share in family meals. Prior to starting her private practice, Hilarie worked as a clinical dietitian at a children's hospital in Michigan, and she completed her dietetic training at UC Davis Medical Center, along with an undergraduate degree from Michigan State University. And I am also very pleased to introduce Nicole Bolufe, a mother and advocate for her tube-fed child. Her son Liam has MCT8 deficiency, and so she'll be sharing more about their journey around Liam's diagnosis and positive experience with blenderized tube feeding. So on that note, Hilarie, the mic is all yours.
Just realized I was muted. Well, thank you so much, Oley, for having me. I am so excited to be here. I'm excited to chat with you all today. I really hope this gives you some fresh perspective on tube feeding and helps you just think about things a little bit differently. All right, it's not letting me click through. It must be like, okay, so these are disclosures. So what are we going to go over today? So we are going to learn about tube feeding. Oh gosh, sorry. I think it's a little lag. Let me go back. Okay, so what we're going to learn about today. So we're going to go over what tube feeding intolerance is, as well as the signs to look for that you or your loved one might not be tolerating their tube feeds. We're going to go over how blended food can actually help manage those intolerances and review tips for getting started. I know the major concern is, how do you get started? How do you do this? So we're going to go through some practical tips, things to make this more efficient for you, as well as some common concerns that might come up that might not actually have to be concerns. And then we're going to hear from Nicole. She's going to share her experience with blenderized tube feeding with her son. So what is tube feeding intolerance?
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? There's a lag.
Oh.
Does everybody hear me?
Yeah. Yes, I think so. Do you have some, are you going to go into yours? Because I think we're going to do yours at the end of mine. Unless you wanted to introduce yourself too quick.
Oh, okay. I thought you called me. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. It's okay. I'll call on you after mine.
Getting
But
a
if you introduce
lag.
yourself quick, you can do that too. Okay, so we'll go into what tube feeding intolerance is. So this is really when someone has trouble digesting, absorbing, or tolerating the food through the feeding tube. So some things to look for would be nausea, vomiting, abdominal distension, bloating, things like gas, or just feeling really uncomfortable, bowel irregularities like constipation, diarrhea. So I want to make this first part a little bit interactive. If you feel comfortable, I'd like to see who, if you or your loved one is experiencing any of these symptoms, maybe on a daily basis or quite frequently, if you want to raise your hand or put a me in the chat. My experience, a lot of people are dealing with this, and I've worked in a lot of different children's hospitals, and it seems like more often than not, people are experiencing one or more of these symptoms. So let's break this down a little bit more. All right, so the leg and the, okay. So we're going to start with the upper gastrointestinal symptoms. So these are things like reflux, like vomiting. I primarily work with young children, and this is what I see happening most often when it comes to feeding intolerance, something that really seems really hard to navigate. So what I typically see happen for families is there's a lot of formula changes. So this comes with a lot of headaches. I'm sure some of you have experienced this, where you are trying to find the perfect formula for you or your loved one. So this comes with insurance headaches. You're also dealing with just finding the formula. You know, there's been all the formula shortages. So finding the formula can be really tough. But this also comes with a lot of adjustments. So this might be something that you're working with. Maybe you do smaller, more frequent feeds. Maybe you are doing feeds overnight to help get that volume in, or you're using a feeding pump. All things that might be helping, but they're making the plan a little bit more unmanageable because you just keep slowing down those feeds, and eventually you're feeling like that's all you're doing is feeding around the clock just to keep reflux in a good spot. You might also have been switched from getting your feeds into your stomach to your jejunum, so you get a GJ feed, again, getting those feeds pretty much around the clock. And again, a lot of those medications. So a lot of medication changes, which often can feel like you might just be band-aiding the problem and not necessarily addressing the root cause, right? So this just all makes the plan more and more unmanageable. You might find that it's quote unquote working. It's making reflux at bay. You're not having as much vomiting, but it's not working for you. You know, it's just not working for your family and your lifestyle. And so what I happen to see so often with families is they feel like, man, we can't leave the house, or we can't even get our therapy appointments in because we're feeding around the clock and we can't move my child at all, or there's a lot more vomiting. So it just makes the things more and more unmanageable, even though it's quote unquote working. Well, then we have our lower GI symptoms. So this is things like constipation, diarrhea, probably irregularities where you're kind of dealing with both. So then again, what I see here is what typically happens is a lot more formula changes. So again, all those headaches of finding the perfect formula, finding it in the store, getting insurance coverage. It's not super easy to find something that works for you. And then if you find something, it's hard to find it often. There's also a lot of management with fluid. So if you're not pooping well, maybe your team is helping to manage your fluids. Well, this can be kind of frustrating for families too, because, and maybe you've experienced this, your team comes up with this perfect plan on paper, but it's not going to work for you. You can't even find time to get your formula in, let alone try to get those fluids in. So that can be pretty frustrating if you feel like, I know I need more fluids, but there's just no way for me to get these in. And then again, too, all of the medications, chasing the medications, you're using a bunch to try to figure out what the best happy medium is. And it's hard to find that balance. And again, that also feels like we're not really addressing the root cause here. We're just band-aiding the problem. So again, that leads to a lot of frustrations. You just feel kind of concerned and maybe even defeated if you're at this point where you're in this spiral and nothing seems to be working. So this really is an ongoing cycle, and they all sort of play into each other. So let me give you an example. This is something I see over and over again with patients that I've worked with, is they all start just to like spiral into each other. So I have a 3-year-old I just recently started working with. He really struggles with vomiting, with constipation, and with his growth. Well, to keep his vomiting under control, he gets his meals every 3 hours. They restart the feed on a pump, but it takes 2 hours for that meal to be given. So as you can imagine, by the time that 2 hours is done, and now you have to keep them upright to manage the reflux, by the time that's all done, it's time to get the food going again. And then the struggle is they can't find time to get the fluids in because they're worried about adding more water if they just finished the feed. So he really struggles with constipation because they're not getting enough fluids in. And then with more constipation, he's vomiting more because that sometimes can happen when you're backed up, you're vomiting more, which means you're losing calories, and then that affects the growth, right? And then you're already having a hard time just getting enough formula in for growth. So it becomes this spiral that you're on, and it's a lot to juggle, and it can feel pretty defeating, right, when you're at this point and you don't really know what else to do. So this, of course, leads people to seek alternative solutions. So this is a survey that Oley put out in the past. They were looking to see who all is using blenderized tube feeding. And so of the people that responded, about 90% of the pediatric patients were using blenderized tube feeding for about 71% of their intake on average. And then of the adults, 68% were using blenderized tube feeding for 50% or more of the nutrition. So this is just one survey, of course, but it does show us that there are people are seeking alternative solutions. So it really is important for dietitians and medical professionals to expand their knowledge and to be willing to learn this so that they can better support their families. So let's back this up a bit. Maybe you are brand new to blended tube feeding, or you have not really familiarized yourself with this. So what is it? Well, it's essentially blending whole food to a consistency that will pass through a feeding tube. So it's as simple as that. But that's different than our standard formulas, which are often highly processed and made from synthetic ingredients. This is made from real food. So I always like to tell families that this does not have to be an all or nothing approach. And I hope that gives you a little peace of mind that you don't have to do 100% real food 100% of the time to get the benefits of blended tube feeding. I also share too, not a lot of people who eat by mouth are getting 100% home cooked meals 100% of the time. So it does not have to be that way with tube feeding either. So what that could look like is you're doing home prepared meals sometimes. Maybe you're using a commercial real food based product. Maybe you're doing all home prepared meals, and I'll go over that in just a little bit, how you can do that efficiently if you do want to do 100%. Or you might just do all commercial blenderized products, and that works too. So there's no one right way to do this. It's simply just incorporating real food into your routine in a way that works for you and your family. So a little history, something I found really interesting when I first started learning about blended tube feeding was that before formula, actually real food was what was used first. So formula was not always around, and maybe you knew that already, but I was being taught in school only about formula. We just didn't even realize that this was an option, or this is how we used to do things. So in the 1970s, formula became available, and hospitals started to use it because it was considered safer. It was sterile. It was much easier for them to use. So it became more widely used, and that became the mainstream way of things. And what actually happened and what I experienced in my education is we're told formula only, nothing else through the tube. In fact, just told, it's not safe to do anything else through the tube. That is changing a little bit. I'm actually working with some dietitian students, and they have a blenderized tube feeding lab, which is pretty cool. So I think things are shifting, but still a lot of pushback. But in the last 2 decades, it's really started to shift. We've seen an increased interest in real food. And I think there's a couple reasons for this. So one of them is to meet the demands of the community who wants better outcomes for themselves. So like I was sharing earlier, you got to get to a point when you're on this spiral of tube feeding intolerance where nothing is working, right? So you are searching for information, you're turning to the community, you're seeing what's working for other people. And what's happening is more and more people are trying this. They're having improved GI symptoms, they're feeling better. And so of course, more people are more interested in it because they want to feel better too. But there's also this desire to have more flexibility. You want to be able to adhere to your own dietary preferences. Maybe you have the specific dietary needs met for medical reasons, but you also might just have prefer to stick with a dietary preference or a pattern for personal reasons, and you can't find a formula that's going to fit that for you. There's also the desire to have better quality nutrition and to have more nutrient diversity, and that can be hard to do with standard formula. And then lastly, it's also been an increase because there's also that desire to normalize the tube feeding experience, to share meals together with your family, to be able to cook for yourself or cook for your loved one. These are all reasons that the interest is growing. But there's also interest or increased interest because there's more and more research coming out. So as more and more people are learning about this, there's more research coming out and showing all the amazing benefits of blenderized tube feeding. So I wanted to quick go over a couple of things that are consistently shown in the literature. These are that we see improved GI intolerance, also that this helps to promote oral intake. We also see that you get more nutrient variety, and then it's also shown that it represents a more natural way of feeding or to consume nutrition. So I want to briefly just go over a couple studies to show the benefits. The first one's going to be focused more on our pediatric patients, and then the next one will be more on our adult patients. So this one is on very young children under the age of 3. And what they did is they looked back to see what the impact was for them switching from commercial formula to blenderized tube feeding. So just to paint you a picture of what this all looked like. So they were switched from their standard formula to a commercial blenderized tube feeding product or real food-based blended tube feeding because the caregiver wanted that or to address signs of feeding intolerance. So this had already happened to these children, but they're looking back to see what impact did it have on things like GI symptoms, medications, and that sort of thing. So they started on a mixture of different formulas. You had some patients who were on your dairy formulas, your standard products, and then some that were on the hydrolyzed, partially broken down products, and then some all the way on the amino acid product, the one that's completely broken down. So what they did, these kids were changed over to either commercial real food-based products or to whole food blenderized tube feeding. So that was defined as 100% home cooked meals or 100% real food in the commercial blenderized tube feeding. So there are products that are the 100% real food. And what they found is that these children were doing so much better, had significant improvements in emesis, constipation, and reflux, and actually had 100% reduction in gagging and retching, which is pretty cool. And what I found really cool is that actually about 2/3 of these patients were on hydrolyzed or amino acid product before the initiation. So I also hear from families quite often is, well, my kid has been on a very specialized formula for a long time. I'm not sure if this is going to work for me. I don't know if they can have whole foods. You know, had broken down formula for so long. Well, in my experience, I've had so many children start on these products and do really, really well on blenderized tube feeding, and this study shows that as well. So what led to these improvements? There's not really a general consensus on why blenderized tube feeding can help reduce negative GI symptoms, but here are some things that they over and over in studies you'll see. So one of the thoughts is that it's with increased viscosity or thickness. So our blenderized tube feeding is thicker than your commercial standard thin formula. So the thought then is that that food is going to be sitting heavier in the stomach. So it's moving further down the stomach, and it's not going to come up as easily as your thin formula. So that can really help with things like your reflux and your vomiting. Another reason is that it's better nutrient profile. It mimics more what's typical for us to consume. So that helps our body and our stomach move the food through more naturally is another proposed explanation. And then lastly, the other thought is, well, there's more nutrient diversity. There's more amazing things that are in this real food that help heal our guts and improve our microbiome, things that you might not be able to get in your standard commercial formula. So now I'm going to go over the adult study. So this one looked at adult patients with head and neck cancer who required a tube feeding during their treatment. And the idea with this one was to look back and see, or just to see how blenderized tube feeding impacts their GI symptoms, things like their weight, and as well as their quality of life. So how this worked, it was going to be done in 3 intervals. So first you had 2 weeks of standard commercial product, and then it was going to be followed by replacing half of their nutrition with blenderized tube feeding, and then followed again by 2 weeks of commercial formula. So the interesting thing was, though, shortly after they started the partial blenderized tube feeding, replacing half of their nutrition with real food, none of the patients actually wanted to go back to commercial formula. They were feeling so much better. And so they wanted to stick with blenderized tube feeding. And actually all but 2 of them wanted to go full force, all blenderized tube feeding. So that was pretty cool. And the reason for this is they were, like I said, feeling so much better. They had improved GI symptoms, less pain, less vomiting. A lot of the GI symptoms were improving. They were also able to eat more. They were able to take more solid food. They were able to drink more of their nutrition supplements. So they actually had a weight rebound as well, right after the introduction of blenderized tube feeding. which is pretty remarkable because typically during this time you'll find, or they find that mostly you're losing weight, you're not able to eat as much at this time of treatment. So the fact that they were able to eat more and their weight was rebounding was pretty cool. And then they also looked at quality of life, which I think is a very important measurement. And they noted that these patients reported a better quality of life when the tube feedings were initially started, but even more so after blenderized tube feeding was started. So prior, 50% reported a very good or good quality of life, while after blenderized tube feeding was initiated, 91.3% reported a good or very good quality of life, which is really cool. So that's a lot of information, and you might be now really pumped and excited to get started with this, but you don't even know where to start, and it feels a little bit overwhelming. So this portion, I want to go over what exactly that could look like, some practical tips for you to get started, as well as go over those concerns, because likely you'll be talking to your team and you might be getting some pushback. So I want to help you prepare for that. So first is, what equipment do you need to get started? So I like to say to get started because there's a lot of equipment out there, and it can feel pretty overwhelming to know exactly like what you need to do or what you actually need, because there's a lot of things that can make this a lot easier, more efficient, but you don't necessarily need that to get started. And in fact, I always recommend to start with the basics, because a lot can change when you get going. So really what you need is a lot of stuff that you have on hand. So this is the stuff you need to prepare and to blend food. So things like measuring cups and spoons, so you can measure out the food. A rubber spatula, so you can scrape out the inside of the blender container and your storage containers. A food scale to measure your food. A food thermometer, just to make sure that you're cooking things to a safe temperature. And then your fine mesh strainer and your blender. So I always recommend having a fine mesh strainer on hand, no matter what kind of blender you have, because there's going to be pesky food pieces that might not get blended all the way. And then you'll end up with clogged feeding tubes, and we don't want that. So having a fine mesh strainer on hand for those days when, even if you have a high powered blender, it doesn't catch everything, you can run that food through the strainer and you don't have to throw it away. You can still use it. Then as far as blenders, so this is a question I get quite often, is like, what blender is best? And really, you can make pretty much any blender work if you use soft foods. Again, if you use that strainer, but most families I work with prefer to have a high-powered commercial blender. The reason for this is because it will liquefy most foods. It's pretty amazing what these blenders can do. Like, you throw a steak in there, you throw things with seeds and peels, and it does a pretty good job of completely liquefying that food, so you're not going to get any clogged tubes. Now, of course, these ones are a little bit more expensive, so there are medical discounts available on the kinds that most people like to use. So talk to your team about that, or there's a lot of information in the different community groups about the blenders and the medical discounts. Then as far as storage and feeding, so you're going to make your food and you need to store it somewhere, and how are you going to feed it? So most people, in my experience, don't blend just one meal at a time. I mean, they might do that, but it's more so like, we're going to blend a bunch of food and just portion it out. So having a good storage container is really helpful. So in my experience, most people like to use mason jars and deli containers. They're freezer safe, you can reuse them, easy to get food in and out of. So my experience, that's what people use mostly. But I have a lot of families that like to use their breast milk bags. Maybe they have a bunch left over, or it's just nice to have something that stacks nicely in the freezer that they can dispose of when they're done. So those are usually the most popular options. Now, when it comes to feeding your blended meals, if you do a syringe feed, something you'll notice is that this meal is thicker. It's not going to flow through the syringe like gravity, like you do maybe with your formula. And you want to keep it thicker, right? The idea is that this is part of why it can be helpful, is that the thicker food sits heavier. So we want to keep it thicker. So you're going to have to use that plunger on the syringe. Well, you might have noticed that the syringes that you get from your medical supply company are not always the best, especially if you do need to use that plunger. That rubber, it usually gets kind of sticky, right? So you try to push it through and it's super frustrating. But if you, and if it gets wet, right? If it gets wet, it gets even more sticky. So there are better syringes out there, and they're ones that have the silicone O-ring. So if you look for those, that you can get some by insurance, but they're also ones that you can purchase out of pocket that work really well. And I know the idea of like purchasing all of the syringes that you need every day feels like a lot, but these ones are actually reusable. So you can use them for months. Most families I work with will just get a handful of syringes and then not need to purchase them for more than every 3 to 6 months. So it's usually not a huge out-of-pocket cost, and it can make a world of a difference if you're using a syringe with your blended food. But if you do use a feeding pump, you can still use a feeding pump. It's okay to use. The thing is that you do need to thin it out a little bit for it to flow okay, so it actually flows through. And it really needs to be completely liquid form. If it has any unblended pieces, that pump is not going to be happy. So just make sure it's blended all the way through, and you might have to thin it a little bit. So I like to point out this part, it's kind of a tough balance to figure out what's going to work best for you. Because if you thin it so much, you might not get those benefits of it being a thicker food. So what I usually do with my patients is, if it's appropriate, we might try the syringe feedings because we can keep it a little bit thicker. So a lot of families I've worked with have found that even though the pump was what they needed with formula, they're actually able to use a syringe because they can keep it thicker. So again, chat with your team about this. It can kind of be some trial and error, but I do like to point that out because it can be kind of an aha moment for a lot of people. And then as far as the feeding tube size, so guidelines recommend a 14 French or larger, or to use clinical discretion. And so I have a lot of families that are using smaller feeding tubes and it works just fine. Just need to be extra cautious, make sure that that food really is completely liquefied and that it might be a little bit thinner so it flows through okay. So just a few tips for getting started. I always want to set you up for success before you even start the transition. And one of those things is, if you can, try to optimize fluids before you get started. Now, I know this is not always so easy to do, so I have some tips coming up for how you can get more fluids in. But what I find is that one of the biggest struggles with switching to blended food is if you do it too quickly or if fluids aren't in a good spot, you can end up with slowed bowel movements and some constipation. So making sure that fluids are in a good spot, so as you add fiber into the diet, you have some fluids to move that through and you don't end up with this bulky stool. So talking to your team about your fluid needs is super important. And as best you can, trying to maximize that fluid intake before getting started can be really helpful. So I understand it's not as simple as like, yeah, do more fluids, right? Like it's not as easy to do that. So there's a couple of reasons for that. And I want to kind of go through that just to maybe give you some new perspective on this. But one reason being, if you're already struggling to tolerate your formula, it can be hard to get those fluids in, just like that patient story I shared earlier. So if you are struggling with volume, you might not be able to get your fluids in. It makes it tough. Something else I see is that fluids are often only given at mealtime and often after the meal. So there's some things that you can do to play around with this so that it's not all of this trying to be at one time. I just think too, for myself, if I only drank my fluids when I was eating and I never got fluids otherwise, it would be hard for me to meet or feel hydrated as well. And I know that it's not as simple as just like sipping on water all day long, like out of a water bottle. It's got to hook things up. And if you have a kid and you have a lot of other things going on, it can be really tough to get those fluids in. But there's ways that you can kind of shift this around. So I'll show you next, but that's why it can be difficult to get your fluids in. And then another reason I find that people are not getting adequate fluids is because they don't know what their fluids are. So your team comes up with this plan for you. They just tell you, here's what you have to do, but you don't really understand what they are. And you try to shift them on your own. You don't see your team very often. So this can be playing into why you might not be getting your daily fluid goal. So I want to go over some tips for actually getting your fluids in. So I think often we say, get more fluids in. You're like, yeah, I'm pretty maxed out. Like I'm not going to be able to do that. So here's some things that I have found have worked really, really well for patients that I've worked with. So one thing is to give the water actually before your meal. So maybe this isn't appropriate for everybody, but I just want to give you ideas of things that have worked. So what I found is that when you try to give your fluid right after your meal, your stomach is already full. And so you're just adding more water, diluting that, and now that all has to be digested. Where instead, if you give the water before the meal, water just needs to be absorbed. So give the water before, it absorbs through, and then you can start that meal on more of an empty stomach and not have to try to fill it with more water after. So that's been something that's been super helpful for a lot of patients of mine, is just shifting when you give that water and still giving it meal times when everything is, already hooked up. But you can also split that up. So if that doesn't work for you, maybe you need to do some before, some after. Always flush it after, right? We want to flush the tubing out, but maybe giving most of it before and a little bit after works best for you. But another option would be to give it outside of meal times if you can. So some families will do a big water flush right away in the morning. Maybe they'll do that right before bed to get some more water in, or otherwise doing it between meals, kind of mimicking that sipping on water between meals, maybe giving small little flushes here and there if they're able to. And then lastly, an idea would be to give some more water with medications. Now, this might not be appropriate. There might be a reason you can't give more water with your medication, or maybe the medication is just, I mean, all medication is important, right? But if you were to give water and there'd be some intolerance, maybe there's a reason not to give it then. So always talk to your team. But I found that with some patients of mine, they can give more water and we're already hooking things up. We're already using the G tube. So they just do a little bit extra water, maybe an extra ounce. And with all their medications, that can really add up and really help them meet their fluid needs. And then just a tip, something I learned from family a long time ago, but it's worked really well for a lot of families of mine, is if you have a hard time keeping track of your fluid intake, maybe there's multiple caregivers involved, or you just have a hard time like keeping track of where you're at, it can be really helpful to fill a water, like a water bottle with your daily fluid goal, and then just use that water bottle all day long to pour for your fluid flushes. So that way, if you're multiple caregivers, you can kind of see where the fluids are at. And at the end of the day, you can see how short you are, or maybe day after day, you're just not meeting your fluid goal. And now it's more obvious to you because you have the water bottle trick. You can start to come up with a plan to try to fit more of those water or more of the fluid in. So then something else I always suggest to, or just to think about, is how do you need to take this slow? And so let me give you some examples. Let's say you have a child or a young child or someone that just has not had any food exposure yet. Maybe they have not had any fiber, no real food. Well, in my experience, if you go from formula without fiber to real food containing fiber too quickly, you're going to end up with being uncomfortable, some gas, some bloating. And that can be kind of defeating, right? Like you're really excited to do this, and then you kind of go too fast, and your child's not feeling well, you're not feeling well, and then automatically like, okay, this isn't going to work for me. But really what I've noticed is if you just take it a little bit slower, maybe you replace one meal, wait 3 to 5 days, replace another meal, and so on, that can really help to ease your body into this. But at the same time, it also can be really helpful for the person blending. If you're blending for yourself, or if you're blending for your loved one, if you don't have to blend all of the nutrition every day from here on out right away, it can help ease you into it too, get used to blending and just slowly replace those meals. Now, if you are someone who has had a lot of food exposure, you've had a lot of real food, and now you have a feeding tube, it might not be as important for you to take things slow. So it really just kind of depends, person to person, what's going to work for you. And then also consider introducing one food at a time if there hasn't been a lot of exposure. So I always leave this up to the team too. But you don't want to introduce like 6 new foods at once, and then there's an allergy and or intolerance and you don't know what it's to. So it can be really helpful to just introduce one food at a time, wait a little bit, introduce the new food so you're taking it kind of slow. That being said, as far as how to do that, a lot of people will use a baby food version. So already pureed, already thin, go to the store, get your carrot puree to try carrots. If you don't want to do the baby food version, you can always make your own at home too. Blend you with a little formula, water, milk, whatever works best for you, and make a thin puree to try out that food once a day for a couple of days. So what does this look like? So there's a lot of different ways that you can slowly start to introduce the new food. And it looks a lot of different ways for a lot of different people. So, and I know this is kind of confusing, so I want to go through some different scenarios as far as what I've seen have worked for other people, as well as what I've seen work, or what I like to do with my patients and what I feel like works best for them. Sorry, it's not moving to the next. Okay, there you go. Sorry about that. So the first option is to just blend a family meal. So this works really well for a lot of people because it makes it easy to share family meals. You don't have to do multiple prep things. You can all just eat the meal together. So what this could look like is you just make a plate like you would if someone was going to eat it by mouth, then throw it in the blender and then add a little bit of liquid and blend. Now, I always suggest starting with a small amount of liquid. You can't take liquid away, right? So just start with a small amount, add a little bit more as needed, and aim for, I like to say, like a thin pancake batter consistency. That seems to be a good consistency that will flow through, but isn't too thin. Now, if you need these meals to be a little bit thicker, or not thicker, higher calorie, what you can do is use a high calorie liquid. So instead of water, using something like milk, or adding a calorie booster, something like a tablespoon of olive oil or some nut butter or some kind of food that is a lot of calories in a small volume will help to make that meal more calorie dense. And your dietitian can help you with that too. The one downside of this is there is a little bit more uncertainty with this. And it can feel a little overwhelming to get started this way, especially if you have been, I don't know if condition's the right word, but you have to be so calculated with tube feeding for so long. To go from being so calculated to just blending a meal and having no idea exactly what the calories are can feel a little overwhelming for people. But that's not to say that you couldn't do it this way and then work closely with your team to monitor growth, do periodic check-ins with what's being blended to make sure there's no obvious nutrient gaps, and adjust just like you would someone that's eating by mouth, not being so calculated with things, just doing periodic assessments, watching growth, and adjusting as you need to. But if you do want to be a little bit more calculated, an idea would be to look at your formula meal. So just start with one of your meals. So let's say your formula feed is 400 calories. Well, what you could do then is build a balanced meal that's also 400 calories, but from real food, and blend that up. So that way, you're getting the right calories, you're starting slow. It can make it easier, a little bit less overwhelming because you're just doing that one meal. Your dietitian can help you plan this meal, especially if you need it to be more calorie dense. Because, for example, let's say you come up with this lovely meal that's lots of fruits and vegetables. It's super healthy from like a nutrient standpoint, but it ends up being 600 mLs. That can be kind of a problem if you can't tolerate 600 mLs, right? So there can be a little bit trial and error to figure out what's going to work best for you. But your dietitian can be super helpful, and you can just practice, try blending some stuff, see what it comes out to be, and adjust from there. So this works well for people who like to take it slow and need to be a little bit more calculated, and enjoy doing this and kind of have the time to play around with things. Another option would be to use a recipe template. So you may have seen things like this before. But the idea is that you follow this template, you rotate through different foods, and it comes out to relatively the same calories. So for example, let's say you have 1,000 calorie template. So you could switch out the protein and the grain following the portions, and it should come out to about 1,000 calories every time. So this is helpful for if you want to blend like a full day of nutrition. Let's say your child, their calorie goal is 1,000 calories. You just plug and play, and every time you come up with this blend, it's going to be around 1,000 calories. So this works well for, let's say you don't have to run out and like get specific ingredients. You can just use whatever you have on hand. Maybe you already cooked rice for other people in the family. You can just use that rice as the grain for the blend that day. So that can be super helpful. You can still share food together, and you still are a little bit calculated with it. The one downside though is that what I find is you can end up with pretty inconsistent volumes, or sometimes it can come out really thick, and then you have to add a bunch of fluid to it so that it thins it out. Then you have this really big blend that you can't actually get in a day. So there is some trial and error with this, but it works really well for some people, especially who like just kind of like a plug and play type plan. And then lastly, this is the way that I like to help families, especially who are getting started. So what I like to do is provide them with recipes that give the exact amount of quantity of food, and it comes out to be a specific calorie concentration so that they don't have to do any calculating or any guessing of what to blend. They just follow this recipe. The idea with this is that if you have a calorie concentration that's close to your formula, you can just swap it one for one, slowly swap formula for blended food, not worry about calories, not have to worry about the weight dropping, and get used to everything else. So this works really well for people who are just getting started and want that workload off their plate. And what I find is that you don't actually have to stick with recipes forever. Doing it this way, you get used to what ratios work, what consistency you're looking for, and slowly you gain confidence to start doing this with your family meals. But again, it just takes the pressure off from the beginning of figuring out what to blend. The one downside with this, though, is that it's probably not going to mimic your family meal. So you might end up having to do this, like you have to make your blended food on the side, and then you also have to cook family meals, which can feel like a little bit extra work. But it's that balance of not having to do the trial and error, and maybe you spent all night coming up with a recipe, then you go to the kitchen, it's too thick. That can be a little frustrating at first, right? So this takes that workload off families' plates. And then the other option would be to use commercial blenderized products. So this could be something where you're using it for all the nutrition. You're using a product that's 100% real food, has a variety of meal choices, and that works well for you. There's other ones that are real food based that you could use as well. But you could also use this in combination with cooking meals yourself. So these are really good for busy days. Maybe you're traveling, you're feeding on the go, or you get home, you have nothing prepared, you're too tired, and you need something that works well. And so having a good backup commercial formula can be so helpful. And like I said, it's convenient, it's easy to use. It's consistent calorie intake and volume. So if you do need to be consistent, that can be really helpful. But it can be expensive if you don't get insurance coverage. This really can depend state to state. So some have really good insurance coverage and some people just can't get it covered. So that can be pretty expensive. This also provides a little bit less variety than home blending. So that can be something to think about too. So now I want to go through some tips to make this a little bit easier. I know you're all very busy people and this has to fit into your schedule. I do like to say too, though, that what I've noticed is this actually can give you time back when tolerance improves. So if you have less vomiting to clean up and less laundry, you're not making as many phone calls, that can make a difference too. So you might find you have some time back and you can actually enjoy doing this stuff. But some things to make it a little bit quicker would be to use minimal prep ingredients, things that are already frozen, microwavable grains that can be helpful. You can also batch prepare ingredients. So think things like your rice and your quinoa and your meats, things that take a little bit longer. If you make a bunch of that at once, throw it in the freezer. That way you have it just ready to go next time you want to blend. And also just batch preparing meals. So spending a couple hours once a week, making a bunch of meals will help you not to blend daily. And then as far as blending tips, so we talked about this already, but having a high powered blender can make the blending more efficient. There is those medical discounts available. Also blend longer than you think. So it seems like a long time to blend for 2 to 3 minutes, but it really does help ensure that food is totally liquefied and you will help to avoid the clogs. And then having a large and small blender container can be super helpful. So imagine you have like a 64-ounce blender and you put a small amount of food in there. Well, it's going to spray up the sides, right? It's not going to get all blended in. So then you're going to have some clogged tubes, which we don't want. So having a large container for those days you want to just whip out a bunch of meals, and having a small container for when you do want to blend just one meal at a time can be really helpful. As far as storage tips go, how to make this process of storing your meals more efficient, I always tell families to, if you are going to make more than one meal at once, just portion it right away into your meal size. That way it's ready to go, already portioned out when you need to use it. It also can be helpful to find storage containers that have the measurements on the side. That way you're not measuring into a separate container and then putting it into the storage container. Transferring the food a million times is not fun. So having a storage container with measurements can be really helpful. And then choosing a container that's really easy to get food in and out of, like those mason jars and deli containers. And then just a couple tips for feeding. So something I've noticed with a lot of my families is when you give a meal right out of the fridge cold, it's usually not tolerated super well. Doesn't feel good to get a cold meal right into your stomach for some people. So I found that if you warm the blended meal, that can really help with tolerance, especially with reflux. What you can do is put it in a warm water bath or leave it on the counter to room temperature. Just remember though, this is real food, so can't leave it out for an extended period of time. So you want to follow food safety rules. And then as far as like how much to give, well, this really needs to be determined with your team. But if you're not really sure where to start, I suggest just starting with your typical meal size. Let's say you tolerate 6 ounces of food at a time right now. Just start with 6 ounces of blended food. Even if you make more in the blender, you don't really want to push it too much. But you may find that as you switch to blended food, you can tolerate more volume. So you will be able to play around with this a little bit. All right, so now we're going to go over the common concerns, things that might come up as things that your team might tell you why you can't do blended food. So the first is food safety. Well, food safety is important whether you consume food by mouth or by feeding tube. And the process with this does not have to be that much different than if you were eating the food by mouth. So things like keeping it clean. So wash your hands, wash your counter space, keep things separate. Don't cut raw chicken on a cutting board and then use that same cutting board for produce that's not going to be cooked. You want to keep food a safe temperature. So make sure that you are cooking your meat to the right temperature and not leaving food out on the counter all day. So things that you would all do by mouth. One check that I think does help families. Sometimes it's like, how do I blend this food? I'm not exactly sure. So I just say, if it's not safe to eat it by mouth that way, don't blend it. So this goes for uncooked flour and egg yolks that are uncooked, or just little things too, like that might not even cause a foodborne illness, but wouldn't be digested well. So like a raw potato, better to cook that, right? So just thinking, how would I eat this by mouth, or how would someone eat this by mouth? And that's how you should add it to the blender. And it can be kind of a good way to check in with yourself. Another thing that comes up is the concern with clogged tubes. So with the right equipment, though, this does not have to be a concern. Like the high-powered blenders that are going to turn that into liquid form, and using a fine mesh strainer will just save the day. So just run it through the strainer, you'll get it in liquid form, and there really doesn't have to be a concern for clogged tubes. All right, so nutrient intake, this is one that comes up quite often, is that you might hear, well, you can't meet your nutrition needs, you won't get enough variety, it's not quote unquote complete nutrition. Well, a feeding tube is really just another way to get nutrients in the body, right? So it does not have to be all that different than how we prepare food by mouth, and a lot of oral eaters are not making sure that they receive 100% of their nutrition every day. So it doesn't have to be that way with blenderized tube feeding either. And I'd also argue that blenderized tube feeding actually is going to provide more nutrient diversity and variety than your standard formula. So you can actually get more nutrient intake with a blenderized diet. So some ways to ensure that you're getting enough food enough nutrient variety would be just to do periodic check-ins. Am I using foods from all food groups? If you can't use all foods from all food groups, let's say you have an allergy or you prefer not to use a certain food group, you might need to do some supplementation, but that applies for people who eat by mouth too, right? So same thing, but to just check in with your dietitian, do periodic assessments. Is there any obvious nutrient gaps? Can also look at growth parameters. That's a good sign that we're not getting enough if we're not growing well. And then also I hear, okay, it's too much work. So yes, blenderized tube feeding is more work than giving formula, but you also find, I know I keep touching on this, but you might find that you get time back when you or your loved one is not puking as often, you're getting less time, you're not using the pump anymore, or you're shorting that feeding times, you're not calling your team as much, you're not spending as much time feeling stressed or worried about feeding intolerance. You can actually get some time back, and even though you're doing more work, you still have more time, and you probably enjoy doing this more than dealing with the feeding intolerance. Plus, there's a lot of ways to make this easier. Like I said before, you can batch blend. A lot of families I work with will use 3 to 4 recipes a week. They'll spend a couple hours getting some family members to help and blend a bunch of meals for the week, and then they're done with it for the whole week. So lots of ways to be efficient. And plus, you can always use the commercial blenderized tube feeding products if you do have a busy day, or if you this works better for you in your schedule. And then lastly, a concern is weight gain. I often hear, let's get weight in a good spot first, or let's make sure they're growing okay, or they might not get enough calories. Well, the literature really does say otherwise. A lot of literature is showing that blenderized tube feeding can really show positive trends in weight gain. And I also would argue that ongoing vomiting or formula intolerance makes weight gain kind of hard too, right? So it's a trade-off, doing a little bit more work, but there's a lot of benefits to doing this, and weight gain has been shown over and over again in the literature. And with the right support and resources, blending meals that meet your nutrition needs really is possible. So finding somebody that is supportive of blenderized tube feeding can make your journey so much easier. All right, so a couple of resources. There's a lot of stuff out there, but 2 that can be helpful to start with are the Oley Foundation. Lots of stuff on their website to be helpful. A lot of patients too, a lot of families I work with like to use the homemade blended formula handbook. So that's something you could purchase. It has a lot of good information in there. I'll also put my email in the chat, so that way after this, if you have any questions that come up or you just need more specific resources, I'm happy to point you in the right direction. So I will put that in the chat. Okay, so thanks for sticking with me. But now for the best part, we will hear from Nicole. She's going to share her story about blending for her son. So Nicole, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. My son, Liam, he was diagnosed with a rare syndrome called MCT8, Allen-Herndon-Dudley syndrome. It's about 300 boys worldwide. We're still finding out more boys are being diagnosed with it. It affects them physically. It affects them for feeding. They don't speak. They don't intellectually, they're disabled. And it was just a very hard pill to swallow when I heard that from the doctor. But he was on a commercial formula, and he was having issues. He was healthy when he was born, and about 4 to 6 months, that's when I realized he was having paralysis on the left side, and he wasn't holding up his head as much. And so we were starting on this journey of finding out his actual diagnosis, because I didn't find it until years later. But we knew that he was having issues with feeding. He was vomiting every single feed. He was even vomiting just water. He was aspirating. We wound up having an emergency G-tube because it was that bad. He wasn't even picking up his head. And once he had that, he continued on the regular formula, and he was still vomiting. So I was on a search for real food for my son. And it was a game changer. In 2 days, he was not vomiting. He was not in and out of the hospitals like he was before, because he was just so dehydrated from vomiting so much prior. And it has helped him so much. I noticed he's happier. He's able to go through his therapies, his physical therapy, his speech, and everything. Because before we would have to stop because he was vomiting. That's how bad it was. So it really has helped him tremendously, and we are so happy to have him on it.
Thank you so much, Nicole and Hilarie.